Yeah, lots of interesting things. Sometimes some surprising things. Sometimes it's hard to read the Gospels and set aside our preconceived ideas and just to look at it, for what it's actually saying. We develop a lot of preconceived notions of things sometimes, and I think it's sometimes it just surprises me when I read something, just to stop and think about what it's saying and what it must have sounded like at the time. Anyway, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, verse 1, it says, the Pharisees also with the Sadducees. And by the way, they were sort of, the Pharisees and Sadducees, it would be like comparable to we might think of denominations. They had different attitudes. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they had conflict generally between them. They had difference of opinion about things. Sort of like, the Baptists and the Assemblies of God might have some differences of opinion on certain, doctrinal points. That's how the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. They were Jewish groups, but they had some disagreements about various doctrinal things. But anyway, they're together here, and they both came, it says, and tempting, it says, desired him, that's Jesus, that he would show them a sign from heaven. Now we get the idea when it says they were tempting him, that we get the idea that they're not necessarily sincere. Wouldn't you agree with that? Like we get the idea that when it says they came tempting him, like they were just trying to put him on the spot, we might say, and asking him to show a sign from heaven. In other words, if you're so special, I don't know what they expected he would do, like make a lightning bolt fall from the sky or something. I don't know what they were expecting, but we get the idea they're not necessarily sincere. And they're asking to show a sign from heaven. And he answered and said, when it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. You hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky, but can you not discern the sign of the times? A wicked and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, and there shall no sign be given unto it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. First of all, he answers them. He evidently discerns their insincerity. And so he gives them a kind of a rough answer, kind of a pointed answer. And he says, you know what? You want me to show you a sign? Well, you can get up in the morning and look at the clouds, and you can figure out what the weather's going to be. He's just saying, you don't need a sign. You can figure out signs. You ought to be able to see for yourself what's going on. That's what he's saying. The implication is of this, in other words, you can look out at the sky and guess or suppose or judge about what the weather's getting ready to be. We can do that too pretty much sometimes. Sometimes we're surprised. But generally that's true. But what he's saying by implication is you should be seeing what I'm doing, and that should be a sign to you enough. You should be saying something's going on here. Like the man of the Pharisees who was sincere and came to him by night named Nicodemus. Remember what he said? He said, we know that you have been sent from God, because no one can do what you're doing unless God is with him. That should be kind of a sign, But they were, we read elsewhere in the Scriptures, they were jealous of him. They didn't want it to be true. He says, no sign will be given to you but the sign of the prophet Jonas. Now, I think we kind of generally know what he means by that, but we can find out specifically what that means. Let's see, we're in chapter 16. We're going to come back here to chapter 16, but back in chapter 12, in verse 38, we can see exactly what the sign of he means. He says, he brings this up again. Jonas is a Greek version of the word Jonah from the Old Testament. In the days of Jesus, Greek language was the language of commerce, and it was a kind of the predominant cultural language. Even though the Romans were dominating politically this part of the world, the Romans had their own language, Latin, but they used the Greek language for commerce because going clear back to the days of Alexander the Great, when Alexander conquered the Middle East all the way over to India, he transmitted Greek culture to all of those places and made Greek the language of commerce and intellectual discourse. Anyway, Jonas is the version of Jonah. The Bible that Jesus and people in his day used was a Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. It was written in the Greek language. That's why these Greek versions of these words that are in our Old Testament in Hebrew turn out like Jonas. Anyway, I said all that to give you a chance to find Matthew chapter 12. what I like to say sometimes, if you haven't found it by now, just give up and look on with your neighbor. Or look up here on the screen. So, I heard John Osteen say that one time. I thought that was pretty funny. Okay, let's see. Is that what I want? Maybe I'm in the wrong chapter.
You have to read down another verse or two.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I wrote that down in my notes here. Chapter 12, and let me make sure I'm in the right. 38. Oh, I was looking at the wrong verse. Yeah. And then a certain of the scribes and the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? We just heard that. And he said, An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. There shall no sign be given to it but the sign of the prophet Jonas. Now he explains in this case. See, he explained it once, and here they are back in chapter 16 asking again, so I guess he figured he didn't need to explain it again. For as Jonas was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And the men of Nineveh shall rise in judgment with this generation, and shall condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonas. And behold, a greater than Jonas is here. Now, that's pretty pointed, and we see specifically what he means by Jonas. He said, just like Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, the Son of Man, meaning him, is going to be 3 days and nights in the earth. In other words, he's going to be dead for 3 days and nights, alluding to his coming resurrection. And he said, you want a sign? How about this for a sign? I'm going to be dead for 3 days, I'll come back. But still they didn't want to accept that either. But you know, the underlying implication of this is Jonah was sent by God with a message of judgment against Nineveh. If you read in the Old Testament, and he was afraid to go because Nineveh was a great empire at that time. And I'll tell you what, they didn't mess around with people. They were very brutal. The Assyrians were a brutal ancient kingdom. And no wonder, you know, if you read about the Assyrians in history, you find out, it'll give you a little bit more insight why Jonah didn't want to go. Like Jonah got on a ship and went the opposite direction. And that's why the whale story comes along. Jonah was terrified of the Assyrians. And listen, you read about them, some of the things they did to people. No wonder he was afraid. And finally but you know what? There's somebody you should be more afraid of, generally speaking, than the Assyrians. That's what Jonah found out. God's bigger than the Assyrians. That's what Jonah had to find out. He said, oh, you know, I guess he was thinking, God must not know what he's telling me. He must not understand how bad these people are. He wants me to go to Nineveh, the capital city of the Assyrians, and preach to them God's judgment. You know what? I imagine he's thinking, yeah, and the next thing that's going to happen to me. So he went and got on a ship and went the other direction. I'll just run away. Well, you can't run away from God. And a storm came up, and the men, we don't really know how they had this kind of insight, but they figured out this Jonah here, he's trouble. And so if we get rid of him, maybe we'll be all right. So they throw him overboard. You know the story. And he's swallowed by the big fish, the whale or whatever. It's 3 days and nights. And you know what? This is interesting. This is a side thought. No charge for this. This is all extra. If you read the story of Jonah, when he is in the whale's belly and he prays and he says, I am in hell. Did you know that? And Jesus, by the way, likened himself to Jonah. I say that because there always are people that come along and they were offended by the idea that Jesus went to hell. There's plenty of passages that lead you to believe that. And I always say to people, if they get mad at me, some people get really offended and upset about that. The idea that Jesus, when he died on the cross, went into hell. My answer is, don't find fault with me. Your problem's with the Bible. When Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost, he said, quoting about Jesus and the resurrection, he quoted David, thou wilt not leave my soul in hell. I mean, Peter kind of gives us that impression. And here Jesus said the same thing. But here's what I was going to say. Jonah was sent to Nineveh to preach the coming judgment. Judgment was coming on. And Jesus makes it very blunt when he says to them, the men of Nineveh are going to rise, he means that metaphorically, rise in judgment. I mean, the men of Nineveh could condemn this generation, meaning that one living right there that was seeing him, seeing his miracles, seeing all the things that he did, hearing him with their own ears speak, saying things that were like words from heaven. You know, he wasn't like, when the chief priests were sent to the temple to arrest him, or the chief priest sent the guards to arrest him, they came back and said, and they didn't have him. They said, where is he? He said, nobody ever spoke like this man. You know, it was obvious that he was not just some man running around with his own ideas. It was apparent and obvious who he was, but they would not see it. And he said, the men of Nineveh will rise in judgment with this generation. What he's saying to them is, time's up for you. Time is up for you. And I'm just like Jonah. In fact, I'm greater than Jonah. And I'm here, and you're fooling around asking for a sign. He was a little bit hostile and upset with him. And, by the way, we see that not very long after, he mentioned a general